Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, When to Worry About Your Child's Worry, with Dr. Melissa Jaffe. I am Haesung Han, Chappaqua PTA District Chair of Special Education, and I am with Amanda Gibral, PTA District Co-Chair. Before we introduce Dr. Jaffe, I am pleased to Amanda will be stepping up as chair next year with her co-chair, Kelly Bronco. There's also one more parent lecture before we close out the school year on sleep with Eliza Montanino, titled Choose to Sleep, Choose to Snooze, Prioritizing Sleep in a Busy World. I am so thrilled to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Melissa Jaffe. She is a psychologist in the Anxiety Disorder Center at the Child Mind Institute. She brings a wealth of knowledge about assessing and treating anxiety disorders in children and adolescents. She has experience working in both schools and clinical settings, which has given her the ability to treat children with a wide range of clinical issues. So our goal today is that you leave with a better understanding of the positive aspects of anxiety, signs of clinical anxiety and how it presents differently in different children. What are some effective and ineffective ways for caregivers to help children manage their anxiety? And when and how can caregivers intervene further? Towards the end of the presentation, we will leave room for Q&A. So please type or share any questions you may have for Dr. Jaffe. So without further ado, I present Dr. Jaffe.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So like Haesung was saying, today we're going to talk about when to worry about your child's worries and then also what to do about them. So I am a psychologist at the Child Mind Institute in Manhattan. And I just wanted to share a tiny drop about what we do. So we are dedicated to transforming children and adolescents' lives. We are a nonprofit, and together we try to create the best research and the gold standard treatment that we can to help children and adolescents in our local and national level. Our work, we have 3 branches. So we have a research branch. We try to have an open science data so that way many people can use our data that we're collecting to help with earlier diagnosis and more individualized treatment for kids. We also have our clinical branch. We have 6 clinical centers. I'm in the Anxiety Disorder Center, but we also have the Mood Disorder Center, Learning and Development Center, the Autism Center, ADHD and Behavioral Disorders, and I'm forgetting one of them, but those are our 6 centers that we have at the Child Mind Institute for clinical care. And then we also do some public education, so a lot of workshops and talks just like this for parents, for teachers, and also for other clinical practices, hospitals. So we really try to end the stigma for child mental health, and then also to correct any misinformation that's out there and disseminate all of the effective treatments that we know. Our plan for today, we are going to talk about the positive aspects of anxiety. We're also going to talk about signs of clinical anxiety. So when does anxiety kind of cross that line? Anxiety is very typical in pretty much anyone in this world. When does it cross that line into a clinical level of anxiety? How does it also present differently, potentially, in different children? We're going to talk about ineffective ways to help children manage their anxiety. And some of these are almost like they're intuitive. They're kind of what we grew up with or what we know or thought works well. However, we sometimes see that leads to further anxiety, even though it's our best effort. And so we'll also talk about effective ways for caregivers to help their children manage their anxiety. And then finally, we'll talk about when and how caregivers can intervene further if they're seeing that clinical anxiety is going on with their child. Here are some of the positive aspects of anxiety. So, like we said, all people exhibit signs of anxiety, and it's really not necessarily a bad thing. A healthy level of anxiety is totally normal. It's our adaptive system at work. And we do want some level of anxiety to tell us when we're in danger or to motivate us to succeed. So you can think of all your high achieving students, children, adolescents who they want to do well, they want to push themselves. So some level of that, they say some grad students are the most anxious bunch because here they are, they were really high achieving and they went on to further education. So some leveling of anxiety is great. It's a strength. We want to be pushed towards and motivated towards success. However, like you can see in this graph, and this is called the Yerkes-Dodson law bell curve, this is the peak level of anxiety that we would want. It leads to the optimal arousal and an optimal level of performance. So if we're too little anxiety, we might see kids unmotivated, a little bit quote unquote lazier, not really pushing towards success, okay with not getting good grades or not doing well or not really getting out of the house, participating in sports and other activities. But on the far end of this curve, we see impaired performance because of how strong their anxiety is. So that's where we have burnout, we have clinical levels of anxiety. Sometimes so much anxiety could lead to depression in kids. And so that's why we see this optimal level of anxiety right in the middle is ideal. So we just want to keep this curve in mind for when we're talking. So normal anxiety, sometimes it's when our bodies warn us about danger that's not there. So that's typical. That would be like, oh my gosh, I have a pop quiz today. And you kind of have that alarm system go off for you. Then you realize, okay, a pop quiz can't kill me. The same thing with like maybe they have to present in school and then they're like, okay, that's not real danger. That's maybe I am worried about my grades or I'm worried how I'm going to be perceived. But these are all false alarms. And that's what anxiety is. And that's all normal. We want that anxiety system because when there is real danger, so say a child saw a fire or they're faced with a bear on a hike, we want children to have that anxiety go off because that is facing real danger. And so the same system goes off without real danger. And we just want kids to recognize, okay, this is real danger or this is my anxiety at play or a false alarm. So when can anxiety become even more problematic than that? Because that level is very normal. It becomes problematic when it gets in the way of a child's ability to function, or I like to say, live a balanced life. We want kids to be able to participate in many different activities in addition to school. And so if we're seeing that school is kind of taking over an entire child's life, or maybe one part of their or just their anxiety in general is taking over their ability to even go to school, that's when we would see it as problematic because they're not able to function across a range of activities in their life. So these next three factors are almost what we can use as a checklist because if these three factors are at play, we're crossing over that boundary from normal anxiety into a little bit more problematic or clinical anxiety. So if parents are wondering, is my kid's anxiety normal or is it crossing over? We can use these three things as a checklist. So the first one is intensity. So the degree of the person's stress. So is your child is it like so intense that they're crippled? Are they physically shaking? Is their heart racing or they're having panic attacks and they can't breathe? Are they cowering and kind of shutting down and curling up into a ball? How intense is that anxiety for them? Or are they able to pretty much go about their day? Yes, maybe their heart is racing a little bit, but they're not severely impaired by the intensity of the anxiety. We also want to look at duration. So can the person recover when the source of the stress goes away? So following a test or following a presentation in school, or maybe if kids have social anxiety following birthday parties, is their anxiety able to go down in a natural way? Or do they keep ruminating about that event over and over and over again? Or we could also say like a family event. Maybe a kid was feeling nervous to meet extended family that they haven't seen in a while. And then as they warm up, maybe 15 or so minutes, are they starting to warm up? Their anxiety is going down. You see them smiling more and interacting more with their extended family members. Okay, great. They were able to recover from that anxiety. Or do they take 2 hours while they're with their extended family? And even by the end, they're still not really engaged or warmed up due to anxiety. Okay, that could be kind of a check for us, like, oh, this is crossing the line. So the duration and their flexibility, their ability to cope with it. And then the final check that we would look for in terms of what would serve as clinical anxiety would be if the stress was interfering with their daily life. And so we spoke about this a little bit, but does it really affect their school day? Does it affect their after school activities and their social life? Does it affect their ability to cope emotionally? If yes, and if we kind of hit at least, I would say maybe 1, 2, or 3. If we hit really any of these, that's when we will want to seek further treatment. Here are the different types of anxiety disorders, just so I've mentioned some of these, but just so we have a big overview of all the anxiety disorders for children and adolescents. So we have separation anxiety disorder. This often pops up in the earlier years. Same with selective mutism, which you see in the middle. Those are early childhood disorders for the most part. We can diagnose them early on, and that's the first one is fear of separation from a caregiver or fear that something bad will happen to their caregiver or to themselves when they're apart. So I'm sure we all know dropping our kids off at kindergarten, maybe even earlier than that, preschool, there was some level of this. But if we look at that checklist, was it lasting a long time? Was it impairing their ability to eventually be dropped off? And was it so intense that your child was crippled for most of the time? So that's, again, how we kind of weave in these two. That's how we would diagnose one of these. Generalized anxiety disorder is our worriers, our kids who just pretty much worry about anything. So if it's germs, bad events happening in the world, the what ifs, all those like worry warts or the what ifs. What if this happens? And what if I get there and then, you come late to pick me up? And then what if this happens? They're just asking all those what if questions. That's pretty typical of our kids with generalized anxiety disorder. Social anxiety, this one's pretty common. This one happens a little bit more so into like late elementary, maybe middle school. Kids start getting self-conscious potentially of like how they present in front of other people, worried about other people judging them. What if people think I'm weird? I can't wear this outfit. People are going to think it looks bad. What are my teachers going to think of me if I don't get a perfect grade? What if everyone judges me or my answers? So then they inhibit and they stop participating in class. So that's a little bit about social anxiety. Obsessive compulsive disorder, that's intrusive thoughts or intrusive obsessions in our brain, and then doing a compulsive behavior to try to rid ourselves of the thoughts, otherwise known as OCD. Selective mutism is the fear of speaking with new people. So again, it happens pretty much in early childhood and kids who feel nervous to have their voice heard. And so instead they inhibit and they often don't answer questions or don't volunteer their answers. So these are the really quiet kids, more than just shyness, but it would come off to all of us as if your child was just shy around new people. Maybe at home, they're super talkative and they're actually not even a shy kid, but in public, they're presenting as more shy. Specific phobias, maybe fear of planes, bees, vaccines, all of that. But again, most kids are afraid of vaccines. And so it's to that nth degree, even more so than the typical level. And then panic disorder, panic attacks, so trouble kind of out of the blue, trouble breathing, difficulty like kind of getting back to your bearings, and then fear of having another panic attack in the future. That would be panic disorder. This kind of gives us an overview of all the anxiety disorders, and now we'll go into a little bit more about anxiety. So these are some of the physiological or the physical symptoms of anxiety. I'm sure we're all very aware of all of these because they happen to us. We just don't always have awareness in the moment. Like if you ask us later on, we could probably go through these. What we want kids to do is to start to recognize them in the moment. So you might start sweating or get your cheeks get flushed and you get really hot. Maybe your breathing quickens, your heart beats faster. your stomach hurts. And that's why we hear of a lot of kids complain of stomach aches. It's not to say they're not real, because I'm sure your kid does have a stomach ache. What we want them to kind of identify is if it's due to anxiety. They think it's more of an anxious stomach ache, or if there's something medically going on with their stomach. And often that's hard to parse out. But what we want to say is, no, we believe you. It's real. You do feel a stomach ache, and we think it's due to anxiety. Your muscles might tense. So the opposite of that, we want kids to help kids learn to relax their muscles. Their pupils might dilate. So we want kids, again, to practice relaxation to combat some of these anxious symptoms. And then, and I just want to mention the last one too, racing thoughts. So that's that ruminating, thinking over and over again, how did that go, or what will happen? And that can lead to some headaches. So same thing with the stomach aches, kids might complain of headaches, and we just want to help them parse out when it's anxiety driven. So I'm sure people have heard of the fight or flight response in terms of anxiety. Now, recently they've added a few new ones. So in my training, I learned a fight, flight, or freeze. And recently they've added fawn and flop. And so I'll just talk briefly through these. This is basically what you're going to see your kid do, is probably one of these reactions when they're anxious. So they might get more aggressive and irritable. I'm sure we've all probably snapped at a friend or a partner if we're feeling like really overwhelmed and stressed, like, just leave me alone. It's kind of that type of response. You kind of get more irritable, potentially more oppositional for kids, saying no more, I don't want to do that, screaming. That's not their true personality. It's kind of this anxiety that's speaking. So that's one reaction that you might see, kind of that oppositional, outward, rude demeanor, and that could be due to anxiety. Flight would be leaving. So the kid keeps pulling on your shirt, like, Mom, let's get out of here. I don't want to be here anymore. Now, potentially they're bored. So there could be many functions, but potentially they're anxious there and they want to leave. So it'd be getting out of the place, escaping whatever is making you anxious. Or maybe they're sitting down to do their homework, and homework time makes them really anxious. And so that here they are trying to take a million breaks or delay, trying to leave the room that their homework is in to try to combat this anxiety that they're feeling in their body. Freeze would be a lot of our socially anxious kids. So it almost freeze up or tense up in front of new people. You might see this most often when giving presentations, or, you've rehearsed things ahead of time, like at, say your kid has a fair or something that they're presenting, a poster fair, and you've practiced a million times, but then they freeze up around other people. So that might be an anxious reaction. Fawn is kind of like that word vomit, fawning over other people, or being like a overly people pleaser and trying to get everyone to like them. But it's kind of too much, being too in other kids' faces potentially. And then flop is almost like this depersonalized, you're not rooted in reality. That's one of the newer ones. And it's, from what I've seen, mostly linked to trauma. But it would be kind of like feeling like you're not in the situation. And that could be an anxious reaction as well. So we're going to first talk about the ineffective ways to treat anxiety in children, and then we'll move into the effective ways. I just think these are so important to mention because these are pretty, like I said, they're kind of more intuitive to us, and yet we actually might be maintaining a kid's anxiety. And I'll tell you why. So in this graph, we're going to start up here where a child faces an anxiety-provoking situation. Let's say they learn about a test the next day and they feel unprepared. So the child might get anxious, and as the adult, we might get anxious because we're like, oh my gosh, my child is feeling so distressed. They have a test tomorrow. I feel so bad. I see them getting worked up. This is uncomfortable for me in addition to them. So the child might freeze or avoid. Maybe they ask you Mom or Dad, do I have to go to school tomorrow? Can't you just tell them I'm sick? Can you send an email? I don't want to go. I don't feel prepared. I don't want to do that test. Potentially what we do is we might rescue them. So we might end up sending that email and saying oh, my kid, we could either be honest and my kid feels unprepared for the test tomorrow, or it's too much for them. Or we might say you know what, they're not feeling well, and we rescue them in that moment. The good thing in the short term is that the child and the adult's anxiety is lowered. So the parent's like, okay, phew, my kid won't be in distress all night because they have a test tomorrow. And all day tomorrow, they're not going to be freaking out ahead of that period where they have the test. And the child feels their anxiety lowered in the short term again, is because they are like, phew, I don't have to take the test tomorrow. Tonight I can relax, I can have a good night, and tomorrow I know I'm not going to have to go into school and take the test. However, this creates a loop because they don't see, oh, actually, I can face what makes me anxious and get through it and see it as a challenge. And so then it becomes this reinforcement cycle where we're actually maintaining their avoidance, which leads to anxiety, and it will lead to more anxiety in the future. So you can tell how they didn't see that they can get through this. That, you know what, we can email your teacher potentially, maybe you'll help me send it. And we can say, oh, we're feeling a little unprepared. We're still going to do our best. We're just giving you kind of like acknowledgement that they weren't super prepared, but we're still going to do our best tomorrow. So that would be showing them that they can actually approach their anxiety rather than run from it. So you can see in a parent's best intention here, by rescuing your kid and thinking you're like helping them so much and you are in the short term, in the long term, next time they get a test announced, they're going to have this more tendency to avoid the anxiety provoking situation. So this could happen with a number of different things, not just a test the next day. Maybe a social gathering makes your child anxious, and so they avoid the social gathering. In our best efforts as parents, we might say, okay, no problem. I understand this birthday party is too much for you right now. I'll let you avoid it. But then a few weeks later, another birthday party is going to happen. And so we're kind of maintaining this cycle of anxiety. So this would be known as like enabling or over accommodating a child. So caregivers are inadvertently playing a role in the child's anxiety symptoms because we're either participating in the child's anxiety behaviors, which is either avoidance, or if a kid is reassurance seeking from you a million times. And I could talk a little bit more about reassurance seeking, but asking you the same question over and over. Am I going to do well tomorrow? Am I going to fall? If I'm just thinking of like an ice skating performance or something. Am I going to fall? Am I going to be okay? Who's going to be there? Who's going to be watching me? How am I going to do? All those reassurance questions, those are also maintaining their anxiety or helping them avoid, like we said. So that would be like our inadvertent role in maintaining a child's anxiety. Enabling helps children avoid engaging in the activities they fear. But like we said, avoidance maintains anxiety in the long run because kids don't learn that they can actually cope with their fears. They could have went into school that next day, or they could have went to their ice skating performance, or they could have went to that birthday party, just in those 3 examples that we just gave. And they could have, saw that they can cope with their fear, whatever that may be. Now, of course, on the other hand, so it's kind of 2 sides of the spectrum. One is overly accommodating and enabling. So we're like kind of rescuing them in all moments. The opposite end of the spectrum, though, is flooding, totally flooding a child with their anxiety. And this would look like making them face their fear, the biggest fear, right away. So like, it's fine, just throw them into it. It's almost like that expression, throw them into the deep end. It's fine, throw them in, they'll do their best. That can be especially flooding for a child who has a fear of whatever we're flooding them with. And so instead, we want to provide reasonable accommodations for things that are too hard for the child right now, and gradually we'll work up to that bigger fear and or will fade out supports over time. And so it's kind of the middle ground. So it's not overly accommodating and taking them out, removing all anxiety, pushing things out of the way so that our kids never feel anxious. But it's also not throwing them into something that's their hardest thing in the world. And so that would be flooding. We want to find that middle ground. So some common accommodations might involve bathrooming. Maybe they're really anxious to use the bathroom, the public bathrooms, or the bathrooms with like the other kids around. So we might provide them bathroom accommodations, or eating. These are all super common for school. Assignment accommodations. So maybe once in a while, extended deadlines or ability to use the computer. Maybe some testing accommodations because they're so worried what's going on around them, or potentially so distracted what's going on around them. They might have testing accommodations for the short term, hopefully. Presentation accommodations. Maybe they're so flooded with anxiety, and this is the one thing that they have so much trouble doing. Presenting in front of a class of 25 kids and their teacher would be way too overwhelming. Can we break it down? Can they present in front of 5 people in a small group or one-to-one with the teacher just to start? And then we'll work up by growing the group size of people they're able to present to. Do they need extra help from teachers? Do they need counseling potentially? That would be an appropriate accommodation for a lot of kids. So individual or group counseling to help them work up to that, or any other related services. So these are all the accommodations that you'll see often in a school setting. Some are put into an individualized education plan or an IEP or a 504 plan, and some are just done more on the fly informally by working with your child's school team. Here's a little bit more about how we effectively break that cycle that we saw before, and we help children manage their anxiety. So I love these, and this is an example of one that I use in therapy very often, because you could put any fear at the top, and you could put all the gradual steps up to that fear. And so it would range from what the kid is least afraid to do to what they're most afraid to do. And it helps them gradually approach their feared situations. So it's moving away from helping them avoid their anxiety-provoking situations fully, but it's also not flooding them. Flooding them would be making them do what they're most afraid of right away. And I think we kind of have a tendency as adults to be like, it's not that scary, just do it. But that's actually what they're most afraid of. And it's irrational. Anxiety is irrational. We know that. But that is the child telling us, they're probably screaming it to us like, I can't do that. That is literally my biggest fear. And so if we said, no, it's not, you're fine, just do it, that's putting them in a flooded state, because that's literally what they would probably put at the top. I'll give you an example. So a lot of our kids are afraid of like sleeping alone in their own room in the dark without their parents laying with them. So my fear is probably sleeping alone in the dark. And so what we would do if one night we're like, you're fine, no one's there, there's no such thing as monsters, you'll be totally fine, go sleep on your own. Maybe once in a while it'll work, but usually a kid will give us a lot of pushback. No, I can't. I'm telling you, I'm so scared of this. Like, I can't sleep alone. I need you. So what we do is hopefully we would say, okay, no problem. Let's break it down. So what if I laid with you? What if if I sleep in your room with you one night? Then what if I laid with you for maybe 45 minutes until you fall asleep, and then I'll leave? What if we put a nightlight? What if you kind of come up with all those accommodations like we spoke about that would, and this is very collaborative, so your child can help you with these steps. And so that way, then what it ends up being is that they're sleeping alone in a room in the dark, but we are working up to it. So how can we help you break this down into steps? And every, few days after you've done each step, maybe 3 times or so, and we provide a lot of positive reinforcement at each step, which is, we'll get into more of it later, but praise or like some sort of little rewards along the way. We'll keep gradually going up these steps until we're up to your fear. I want to do another example since this is for school. Maybe their biggest fear is making mistakes in class. So a ton of our perfectionist kids, they're like, no, I can't get anything less than 100. If I get a 98, absolutely not. Like, that makes me so anxious. So I need to really study extra hard, or really go that extra mile, stay up really late doing my homework because I need that 100. And so what we would say is, my fear is getting less than 100 or making a mistake. And then we would gradually build up to that. So can you participate in class? So this isn't graded because you're just participating during the lesson. Can you raise your hand even if you don't know the right answer? And can you take a brave guess? Cool, that would go on here, because it's not necessarily, you're not getting docked in grading, but here you are taking a risk and taking a brave guess in class. And then can we study, until a good enough period, you feel pretty good, but maybe you didn't get to like that one extra double check or extra review. Okay, great. That would go on step 2. And then step 3, can you read through all the material once, but you're not going to look at that extra study packet that you have? And this is really only if this is a problem for your child, if they're getting burnt out, if it's too much work, they're staying up late. If it's not the case, if they're getting all their work done and they're still able to live a balanced life and they're totally fine, maybe once in a while they stay up a little late, but it's not really impairing, we don't need to do this. These are for the kids that it is just so burnout inducing and overwhelming, and they're staying up so late, they're not getting enough sleep. It's basically if it's problematic, that's when we would want to use one of these. And then ultimately, the goal isn't to eliminate anxiety altogether, but to help a child kind of tolerate it, manage it, cope with it. Because a child might always, like in our examples, they might always be fearful of the dark, or they might always be fearful of making a mistake, but at least it's not so problematic for them anymore. Now, a lot of our kids will probably give us some pushback, like, why would I want to, work on this fear? This is my biggest fear. I don't want to sleep alone in the dark, or I want to get the 100s in school. I want to be perfect. Like, why would I want to work on this? We get that a lot. So first, we want to validate being a kid or a student is super hard. And it does make sense that someone may feel anxious given the situation. So this is kind of the opposite of like invalidating a child's concern. We talked a little bit about the invalidations, like you're fine, just do it. You're okay. It's not a big deal. That would come off really invalidating to a kid who is telling us, no, this is like really bringing me a lot of stress. So first, we just want to validate them. We want really anyone in a child's life to validate them. So their friends validate them, their caregivers or their parents, and their school, their teachers. We want people to believe them that this might be hard for them. That's kind of that first step in gaining their trust, and then we can work through it. And we want to acknowledge that facing your fears is hard, normalize. Like, yeah, we all want to kind of run away from the things that make us anxious. I'm sure as adults, we all have something that make us pretty anxious. And so we don't necessarily want to face our fears. And here we are asking the child to face their biggest fears. So we want to just normalize, like, yeah, facing your fears is very hard. Avoidance is much easier. However, what could be in it for you? And so we want them to start thinking of their long-term goals. Maybe you've really been wanting to go to that sleepaway camp. And so practicing sleeping alone in the dark in your own room is going to help you get to that goal. Or you've been wanting to have sleepovers with your best friends. Or maybe with making mistakes. Like maybe your goal has been wanting to like spend less time on your work. So let's break it down and help you get there because you want more time for hockey or whatever you're playing. So we kind of start to grasp like what would help a kid work through this fear. And we want to incorporate their long-term goals, their strengths, and their interests. We want to set realistic long-term goals and then the small steps in that ladder to achieve them. And then as the children work toward completing the small steps, we want to provide positive reinforcement. So I mentioned this briefly before, it would be labeled praise for effort or for hard work or trying their best or being brave, being kind, being flexible, and showing resilience. I wrote those all down because that's all you'll see. That's not necessarily outcome driven. It's more effort driven, or it's being a good person, being flexible, being brave. So if they work through their fear ladder that we showed before, that's really brave of you. We're really proud of you. So showing them that and telling your kids all of this, that was really brave of you to stick up for your friend, or that was really kind of you to hold the door open for that person walking behind you. That's what we want to see more of in our kids. When one day, when they're older, it's not going to be like, that was really brave of you for getting that A, potentially. That's more outcome driven, or like, we're so proud of you for getting that A. Who do we want them to become as people? And so that's why we want to praise for what we want them to become. And then if needed, so sometimes still, if it's a kid's biggest fear, yes, we can praise them and we can kind of like work in their long-term goals. If it's not necessarily working, we might want to add in some small rewards. So this could be like little toys, a little treat, maybe outings that they've been wanting to do, maybe something as big as like if they've been wanting to visit American Dream or the amusement park or something like that, we can add that in. That would obviously be a bigger goal and once they accomplish many steps. So you can kind of come up with some sort of positive reinforcement system with your child. Just some things to be aware of. These are going to trigger or exacerbate the symptoms for your child, and it's going to make anxiety more difficult to manage. So it's possible if you've seen your kid in a super anxious state and it was more temporary, it's possible some of these factors were at play because we all have a more anxious day or we all have a rough time. So if it's a little bit more like condensed, your child's anxiety, and it's really infrequent, it's possible it was due to one of these triggering events. So fatigue or poor nutrition, medication side effects, or illness. Environmental, we have like unexpected changes in schedule. Some kids don't do well with like if there's a change to the schedule or transitions. Again, if it's more ongoing, then it might be a fear of theirs. If it's more short term, it's possible this was more triggering for them. An argument with their peers or with their family, or maybe a significant other if it's adolescence. Any sort of like death anniversaries or long commutes we even have here, because maybe I know we've probably all experienced like a ton of traffic. You come in stressed, and then anything that gets thrown your way, your boss emails you, and that makes you even more anxious that day. When normally, if your boss emailed you for a task, you might not be as anxious. So any of these things are almost like setting events that can set the stage to make us more anxious. So just pay attention to these in your child. Try to minimize them as much as possible, but of course we can't control for all of these. It's just something to be aware of. Mood related, if they're extra frustrated or sad that day, they might just have heightened negative emotions that day. And so again, they might get more triggered with anxiety that day. When normally like they wouldn't be as triggered about something like that. So what we can do is to encourage children and yourself to engage in the self-care first. And self-care in this case means taking care of these needs. So making sure you get enough sleep, you're well fed, you don't have any physical illness, or you take care of it. And then in the middle box, making sure you're aware and treat yourself kindly if there's any sort of like difficult time you're going through, divorce, arguments in that moment. Just be good to yourself, be kind. And then also, if you're just having a more sad day or you're super frustrated because your bus never came or it came late, giving yourself that grace, like this makes sense that I'm feeling like this. This is a little bit more about using a child's strengths and interests to combat their anxiety. So in the middle is all of the character strengths we might want children to have. There's actually a quiz on this. If you look this up, BIA classification of character strengths, kids could take it. It's kind of fun. It's like a multiple choice quiz, just like which character strengths ring true to you? What are some of your values? And how do we use those then to like work towards your goals? So these values are really cute. I thought it has a lot to do with what we were praising for before. So we were praising for creativity or bravery or perseverance, leadership, kindness. So you can kind of like work with your kid on their values and, like let's act according to our values rather than run away from things that's not according to our values, most likely. And then we can also use their favorite activities or shows or anything like that. So we just put a few around the outside. So for example, a way that I often will do it is if a kid is really, really great at lacrosse, for example. They face their fears all the time in lacrosse. Like I would be terrified standing on a field in front of hundreds of people while I'm playing in a lacrosse game, managing my emotions and the stress of that, and getting like, plummeted with a ball coming really fast towards me. I'd run away, right? I'd want to like avoid and run away from the ball. And yet sometimes our kids are so brave and have so much strength in that moment because they go right for the ball. Like here they are diving for it, or like, they're performing in front of hundreds of people in the stands, whatever it may be. So that's an example of how you might use your kids' strengths. Like, hey, look how you manage your anxiety in those situations. Maybe academics or specifically math is really hard for you, but look what you do in your sports. Like you are so amazing in sports and you're able to handle those challenges that come your way, whereas other people might try to avoid those. So how can we help you to push forward with math just like you push forward with lacrosse? That's just an example. Okay, this is so wordy. I'm sorry. This slide has a lot, but we'll run through the top really quick. So basically, we can help kids, we can teach them the coping skills that they can use when they're feeling super anxious. We can model the coping skills for them because they're good for us anyway. And then we can also reinforce them. We can tell them we're really proud of them when they're using these coping skills. So these are at the top is just some of the coping skills: deep breathing, relaxation. Our kids probably want to go away from us when we ever tell them to take a deep breath, but it is so, so effective. So as much as we can get kids to take deep breaths when they're feeling stressed, say they're sitting down to start studying, they start feeling flooded and overwhelmed. If we can eventually get them on the track to, oh, that's my signal, I'm feeling really overwhelmed sitting down to work right now, let me take some deep breaths, that would be ideal. That would be amazing, because that's probably what we use, like, to cope. If we're sitting down for work, we have hundreds of emails. Oh gosh, I'm never going to get through this. All the thoughts are racing through your mind. Let me take a deep breath and let me go one at a time. That's what we want to teach the kids to do. So take a break. Maybe take some deep breaths, relax your muscles. Let's do this. Let's tackle this. You might want to establish coping plans with your children to make it easier to put these coping skills into use in the moment. So you might say to them, like, oh, you have a presentation coming up. I know that can sometimes be anxiety provoking for you. Let's practice it ahead of time. So kind of like coping ahead. What happens during your SATs if you feel really anxious? What can you do? Because I know a lot of kids feel anxious around taking big standardized tests. So you kind of do practice rounds. You like talk through it with them. Oh, we have a gathering tomorrow. I know sometimes gatherings make you anxious. What can you do if you're feeling really stressed at the gathering? Where can you go? And so the kid kind of makes up a cope ahead. So I'm not going to avoid the gathering altogether, and we're not going to let them avoid it altogether. But maybe they can take a 1-minute break in the bathroom and come right back. Maybe they can go get some water. Maybe they can take some deep breaths. And same thing with like the SATs. What are they able to do? Can you like sit down and do 3 deep breaths and calm yourself down and then go one at a time? So we want them to cope ahead and practice and talk about this ahead of time. And then, of course, we want to positively reinforce. We want to give labeled praise to when our kids are using these coping skills. They are approaching difficult situations. It's not to say like, oh, only when things are easy for you, we're going to praise you. Like, oh, you got through that gathering, that family gathering, no problem. We're so proud of you. It's like, no, if you struggled and you still were able to stay in that gathering, take a 1-minute break, come back and cope with your anxiety, that's what we're really proud of. Like, even during your SATs, if you did get super anxious, you were able to stay and finish out the test. We are so proud of you for that, right? Like, that was really big. That was brave. So we want to be a cheerleader by encouraging children to take brave guesses in school, face your fears, and potentially that could be like turning in an assignment. That's good enough. We were talking about perfectionism before. Maybe, you know what, if you've been working on this assignment till 9 p.m. and your bedtime was back at 8 p.m., we need to just call it good enough. You've done it. It's good enough. Let's submit it. So this is all kind of what we want to praise. Wow, that was really brave of you. I know you wanted to stay up working on it. We're really proud of you for knowing when enough was enough and submitting. Now, with all of those effective interventions, we might still have a kid who is super, super anxious. And so if you've put some of those interventions into play, you've tried your best, you've really worked on it, and your kid is still kind of having one of these symptoms, we might want to seek further treatment. And so here's another checklist for you guys. This is signs intervention may be necessary. So further treatment may be warranted, like not just the at-home parent treatment or school treatment. We might want more outside of school treatment. So chronic physical health symptoms. So like for days, your kid is getting these chronic stomach aches or headaches. We mentioned that's typical of anxiety, but if it's becoming such a pattern and it's dragging on, of course, we want to check them medically if it's a physical health symptom, but then also we want to check them in terms of their mental health. If they're extremely jittery, now this one's a tough one because it could be like more of like an attention, ADHD, hyperactivity type of thing for jitteriness, but it also comes along with anxiety. And so for this, if your kid's overly jittery, they can't sit still, they're fidgety or having any repetitive body behaviors like nail picking, potentially that's their anxiety coming out. If any of one of these in isolation is just like has always been typical of them and it's not as super problematic, then it wouldn't warrant further treatment. But if we're starting to see all of this or a few of these come together, that's when we might want further treatment. School refusal, your kid is absolutely refusing to school. And this is more than just one Tuesday, like today, back from Memorial Day weekend. They're not wanting to go to school because all of us are probably in the same boat. This is more than that. This is more extended, more of a pattern. They're constantly refusing school and they have a lot of absences. They're excessively seeking reassurance. So again, it's not just the one event that they're the most nervous about, but they don't really ever ask you all those what if questions. Or are they asking what if questions constantly every single day or, many days a week for most events that they're coming up on? That would probably warrant it. Are they avoiding activities that they either previously did or avoiding trying new activities? Are they unable to do their job or function as a child? So is the anxiety so impairing? Like we said, unable to live a balanced life. Are they making this is a big flag for us, the second one on the second column, concerning comments. So any sort of like suicidal ideation, whether passive or active. And now a lot of kids will say it in like almost like a joking manner, like, oh, I'm going to kill myself. I have so much work today. But of course, we want to help the kids see like this is actually a serious statement. We want to talk through that. Were you saying in a joking manner? If so, how can we find other joking words to say? It's like, oh, I can't take the amount of homework I have. That would be much better than like, oh, I want to kill myself for this amount of homework. But of course, if we're seeing real suicidal ideation, so either I want to kill myself or I wish I wasn't here, or they're super burnt out and it's more in a less jokey way and it's more in a serious way, of course, we would want to refer them for further treatment. If they're spending a ton of time at home, they don't want to leave the house, they no longer want to engage in activities, go outside, and they're spending a lot of time on screens. If they're feeling isolated, they're not really hanging out with their friends. And again, like this is a normal progression as kids get older, potentially, but if it's pretty concerning, if they're never hanging out with friends, if they're totally isolated, they're not even going after school to the deli with the other kids or anything like that. They're not talking to anyone on their sports teams. Like, okay, that's a concern for us. If there's a sudden reduction in grades, that would be signaling to us maybe they're getting really burnt out and they just don't care anymore because they can't. It's just too much. Or if there's any sort of extreme oppositionality. So they've just gone completely oppositional at home. They won't follow directions. They're screaming or yelling at you. That would also be a sign. Here's some tips for intervening if you do see your kids kind of hitting any of these on the checklist. So first, you might want to notify your child support team if you have any concerns. So here's what I'm noticing. You give them all the behavioral observations. Here's what I'm noticing in my child. You might want to go to their teachers, to their school psychologist, or to the administrators, or potentially if you have an outside treatment team or want to seek one, you bring all of your data to them. So you're like, here's what I'm noticing in my child, and here's how this is different than in the past. We obviously want to stay calm when you are approaching your child directly, asking questions, listening to them. What's been going on? I've been seeing that you haven't been hanging out with your friends as much, or I've been seeing that you've been staying up really late doing your homework. Talk to me about that. You want to try to avoid making assumptions with that. So you want to ask your child what's going on from their perspective. We want to also just lightly educate kids about burnout, anxiety, like potentially this is a reason. We don't want to force it on them, but we want to kind of like, if they're starting to give us hints that it is due to this, we might want to just start giving them some psychoeducation, a little education about anxiety and what it could do to us, kind of what you learned today. So we can educate kids about this in a more developmentally appropriate way, of course. We want to normalize challenging situations that come up often for children. So again, that was like normalizing, lots of kids go through this, or even adults go through this sometimes. We all have our fears. It's totally normal. Validate it. And then kind of a wrap up of everything we've spoken about. We want to encourage self-care for both the kids and for us, because those can be more triggering if we're feeling any of those triggering setting events that we spoke about before. Those could be more triggering for our anxiety or other negative emotions. We want to encourage gradual exposure, so that fear ladder we spoke about, and gradually working up to a child's fear. We want to encourage social support, so whether that's their peers in school or outside of school, or if that's the treatment team or the support team, we want to encourage all that support. Like, hey, listen, we have really good resources here. Let's put our heads together and figure this out. And then potentially we want to seek professional help when needed, using those checklists that we mentioned before. So that was all of this in a nutshell. I'm just going to check. Okay, I'll spend 1 minute on this, because where we are at in the school year, I wanted to mention that we can do a lot of these exposures over the summer. So now that we're kind of wrapping up in school, it's kind of, I think maybe what we do, like if summer's lighter, we're like, oh, let's just breathe, and that's totally fine. Take a break. And summer, though, when things are calmer potentially for kids, that is a good time to start doing some of these gradual exposures, especially the lower level ones, because that way they're not working on their hardest fears and their schoolwork at the same time. So all this to say, summer exposures could be really good, especially as you start to ramp back into like August and September. So maybe, you know what, let's do a timed multiplication quiz as a family. Like we'll all race to see who can do it first. Let's go take a tour of the school, or let's go school supply shopping. Let's go to this birthday party in August, because actually that's going to prepare you. I know you feel socially anxious sometimes. That might prepare you for when you go back to school in September and you're faced with 25 kids in your class. So whatever's on their hierarchy, we can start to create that hierarchy with them over the summer, and then work on some of those things, because they're calmer. They don't have all those setting events. They don't have a ton of homework. It might be a nice time for some of these exposures. Okay, I will wrap up there. If we have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jaffe. I was really struck by what you were saying in terms of, this idea of rescuing them. My parents often rescue their children, this kind of need or desire to protect them. And then also on school refusal. So would you be able to speak on, in your practice, let's say that the school refusal for an adolescent was so incredibly chronic, and the parent did everything possible to really support that youth. But they're kind of at like a standstill. They don't know how else to proceed. What are some creative ways that you've seen other schools and other districts really support that youth when it comes to school refusal?
Yeah, that's a really good question, especially post-pandemic. We have a ton of kids who are refusing school because they were home and they were avoiding potential anxiety triggers in school. And so they were really comfortable and they were in this avoidance loop, like we spoke about. And then now having them face their fears and go into school is really hard for them. So basically when it comes to school refusal, and this could be a whole nother talk, I love talking about school refusal, but I'll kind of try my best to summarize it. What we want to do is we want to reduce any anxiety triggers in school. And one example might be if a kid is really struggling in math, or them and their math teacher just really don't get along, or maybe a kid in their math class and them, they once said something not really like malintended, but it came off malintended to your child. So whatever it is, we've just targeted math, but say math is the problem. What we could do is we could reduce the anxiety around math by having them avoid just math class and go to all their other classes. If it's a choice between not going to school at all or just going to school all day and just not going to math. So that's just one example of what we might do, is like reduce the anxiety triggers in school in the short term. On our fear ladder, what the school refusal ladder will look like is removing those demands that are flooding for them right away, and then gradually building them back. Maybe the top of the ladder is like attend school for the full day with no accommodations. But the bottom might be, you know what, go in for one subject, maybe even it's just recess, and then leave. And that's the plan for the day. And that's all you're required to do. We all know it. The school is on board. You are only required to come in for recess. Then the next day we want to build. Can we do lunch and recess? The next day, what's your favorite subject? Okay, great. Art, lunch, recess. and everyone's kind of more on board with this, and then you're building it back. Now, sometimes that's a really slow process. And so like a lot of people kind of want to move this along. But again, like I said, if it's a choice, like a really chronic school refusal, and it's a choice of them attending 0 classes because they absolutely will not leave their house in the morning, or going to 3 classes now, like after 3 days, that's amazing. Like keep building it back. And eventually we'll build back the academic subjects if those are the most anxiety provoking for them. There's a lot of nuances to this, and that's why I said it could be its whole own other talk, because potentially then the work builds while they're missing all those classes. And so then, like, you know, if they're just going to lunch or recess, actually now math becomes an even bigger problem. And so then we might look towards like extra help from teachers or tutoring or things like that. But that's just some of my initial thoughts.
That's great. Thank you. I know that we have some parents that have joined us. If anybody has questions, please unmute and share, or you can post on the Q&A and we can read the questions.
I think while we're doing that, I would mention when I've talked to parents about this webinar and anxiety, of course, the book that's very popular right now, The Anxious Generation, comes up. And so I wonder if you could spend a little time talking about, or whether in terms of your opinion of what the link between technology and social media and children's mental health, and sort of what your recommendations are around that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another topic that's very, very common these days, and also a whole nother talk. And again, I'll summarize. So I would say in moderation. And so kids often will need to use social media, or maybe not social media, more so technology screen time for academic work. And so for that, okay, their recreational time, and especially their time spent on social media, we want to make sure we're monitoring it, and we want to make sure it's in moderation. It's possible that the social media use will feed into, almost will be a setting event or a triggering event for a lot of the anxiety that we spoke about today. And it's also possible it's an avoidance tactic, because kids feel really secure while playing their game. They're having so much fun. They're getting a lot of dopamine and adrenaline while playing their games. And that's like helping them avoid the outside world or any anxiety provoking situations. So we definitely want to help them face their fears, get off the screens. We can use it once in a while in moderation if your kid is able to do that and is able to put it down after their time is up. But we want to make sure they're not on it all the time or too much. Okay. Anyone, you guys are welcome to email me if anyone has any other questions. It's my first name dot last name at childmind.org. Our website has a ton of resources if you're ever curious to hear more about the topics that I spoke about. We have pretty much any topic on our website, so you can always Google our website and then search what you're looking for. There's articles from experts. You can find their videos, education videos that you can show your children. We just came out with like a preschool series, and then we also have videos that range up to adolescence. So feel free, and you can always email me or reach out if you need any help. And yeah, thanks so much for having me.